The game begins with d4 from AlphaZero, and Stockfish responds with knight f6, steering toward an Indian defense setup. Knight f3 and e6. Both sides develop naturally, keeping central tension while preparing to fianchetto or expand. c4 and b6. AlphaZero stakes a claim in the center, and Stockfish signals a queen's Indian defense with the b-pawn advance. g3 and bishop e7. AlphaZero prepares to fianchetto the king's bishop, while Stockfish completes standard development. Bishop g2 and bishop b7. The fianchettoed bishop on g2 eyes the long diagonal, and Stockfish mirrors with its own fianchetto setup. Both sides castle kingside. The opening phase concludes with kings tucked safely away and central pawns poised for action. d5. AlphaZero advances aggressively in the center, challenging black's pawn structure. This pawn break opens lines and invites tactical complications. e4 was also possible to clamp down the center, but d5 forces immediate decisions and exploits the pin on the e-file. Rxd5 and knight h4. Stockfish accepts the challenge and captures on d5, while AlphaZero repositions the knight toward the kingside, eyeing f5, c6 and cxd5. Stockfish reinforces the center with the c-pawn, and AlphaZero recaptures, maintaining central control and opening the c-file. Knight takes d5, and knight f5. Stockfish recaptures with the knight, centralizing it on d5. AlphaZero immediately challenges with knight f5, targeting weak squares around black's king and preparing e4. Knight c3 was the classical choice to support the center, but knight f5 creates immediate tactical threats and keeps Stockfish under pressure. Knight c7 and e4. Stockfish retreats the knight to c7 to avoid exchanges, and AlphaZero surges forward with the e-pawn, staking a claim in the center. Bishop f6 and knight d6. Stockfish repositions the bishop to f6 to contest the center. AlphaZero's knight d6 is a stunning leap, landing on an outpost deep in black's position and forking key squares. The knight cannot be easily dislodged, and controls critical dark squares. Knight c3 would have been more restrained, but knight d6 creates immediate tactical complications and pins down black's pieces. Bishop a6 and rook e1. Stockfish activates the dark-squared bishop to a6, targeting the knight on d6. AlphaZero brings the rook to e1, adding pressure along the e-file. Knight e8 and e5. Stockfish retreats the knight to e8 to defend against AlphaZero's threats. AlphaZero pushes e5, gaining space and cramping black's pieces. Knight takes d6 and Exf6. Stockfish captures the invasive knight on d6 with its own knight. AlphaZero recaptures with the e-pawn, pushing it to f6 and creating a passed pawn deep in enemy territory. This pawn becomes a long-term asset, restricting black's pieces and threatening to promote. Recapturing with the queen was safer, but xf6 opens lines and creates dynamic imbalances. Queen takes f6 and knight c3. Stockfish recaptures with the queen, and AlphaZero develops the knight to c3, bolstering the center and preparing further piece coordination. Bishop c4 and h4. Stockfish activates the bishop to c4, targeting the f1 square. AlphaZero pushes h4, preparing a kingside pawn storm and restricting black's options. h6 and b3. Stockfish plays h6 to give the king breathing room. AlphaZero's b3 is a cool-headed move, forcing the bishop on c4 to make a decision. By attacking the bishop, AlphaZero gains time to consolidate its position. Simply developing with bishop f4 was also strong, but b3 adds precision and forces black into passivity. Queen takes c3 and bishop f4. Stockfish captures the knight on c3 with the queen, winning a piece. AlphaZero calmly develops the bishop to f4, ignoring material and focusing on activity. Knight b7 and Bxc4. Stockfish retreats the knight to b7, and AlphaZero recaptures on c4, maintaining material balance and central control. Queen f6 and bishop e4. Stockfish repositions the queen to f6, centralizing it and eyeing key squares. AlphaZero's bishop e4 is a powerful centralizing move. The bishop dominates the long diagonal and restricts black's pieces. Bishop g2 was safer, but bishop e4 creates immediate threats along the a8h, one diagonal, and prepares further aggression. Knight a6 and bishop e5. Stockfish maneuvers the knight to a6, preparing to reroute it. AlphaZero places the bishop on e5, centralizing it further and controlling key squares. Queen e6 and bishop d3. Stockfish moves the queen to e6, and AlphaZero repositions the bishop to d3, maintaining flexibility and eyeing black's kingside. f6 and bishop d4. Stockfish plays f6 to challenge AlphaZero's advanced pawn, and AlphaZero retreats the bishop to d4, keeping central control. Queen f7 and queen g4, Stockfish moves the queen to f7, and AlphaZero brings the queen to g4, targeting black's weakened kingside. This move creates immediate threats along the g-file and prepares a potential kingside assault. Queen c2 was more restrained, but queen g4 maximizes pressure and forces Stockfish into defensive mode. Rook fd8 and rook e3. Stockfish activates the rook to d8, and AlphaZero lifts the rook to e3, preparing to swing it to the kingside for an attack. Knight ac5 and bishop g6. Stockfish reroutes the knight to c5, centralizing it. AlphaZero's bishop g6 is a brilliant diagonal shift. The bishop targets f7 and h7, creating devastating threats on the kingside. This move forces Stockfish to react and limits its defensive options. Bishop f4 was solid, but bishop g6 creates immediate tactical threats. Queen f8 and rook d1. Stockfish retreats the queen to f8 to defend, and AlphaZero brings the other rook to d1, doubling on the central files. Rook ab8 and king g2. Stockfish activates the rook to b8, and AlphaZero moves the king to g2, making room for further piece coordination. Knight e6 and bishop c3. Stockfish centralizes the knight to e6, and AlphaZero repositions the bishop to c3, maintaining flexibility. Knight bc5 and rook d1. Stockfish brings the other knight to c5, and AlphaZero doubles rooks on the e-file, intensifying the pressure. Knight a4 and bishop d2. Stockfish maneuvers the knight to a4, and AlphaZero repositions the bishop to d2, preparing further coordination. King h8 and f4. Stockfish tucks the king to h8 for safety, and AlphaZero pushes f4, preparing a kingside pawn storm. Queen d6 and bishop c1. Stockfish centralizes the queen to d6, and AlphaZero repositions the bishop to c1, maintaining flexibility. Knight d4 and rook e7. Stockfish centralizes the knight to d4, blocking key lines. AlphaZero's rook e7 is a stunning invasion. The rook penetrates to the 7th rank, attacking d7 and threatening to wreak havoc on black's position. This move exemplifies AlphaZero's fearless style, sacrificing material for overwhelming activity. A quieter move like rook e3 was possible, but rook e7 creates immediate tactical threats and forces Stockfish into desperate defense. f5 and bishop takes f5. Stockfish desperately pushes f5 to block the attack, but AlphaZero captures with the bishop, opening lines and destroying black's pawn shield. This exchange removes a key defender and exposes black's king to further threats. The position is now critical. Stockfish's king is dangerously exposed, and AlphaZero's pieces swarm around it. Knight takes f5 and queen takes f5. Stockfish recaptures with the knight, but AlphaZero recaptures with the queen, centralizing it and creating devastating threats. The queen on f5 eyes multiple targets, including the weak squares around black's king. Rook f8 desperately tries to defend, but the damage is done. AlphaZero's attack is unstoppable. Rook f8 and rook takes d7. AlphaZero captures the pawn on d7, maintaining the rook on the 7th rank and intensifying the pressure. Stockfish recaptures the queen with rook takes f5, but AlphaZero's material advantage and dominant position are overwhelming. The position is collapsing for Stockfish. Rook takes f5 and rook takes d6. AlphaZero captures the queen on d6, winning decisive material. Stockfish tries rook f7 to create counterplay, but it's too late. AlphaZero's rooks dominate the board, and black's position is in ruins. The material deficit and exposed king means Stockfish is fighting a losing battle. Rook f7 and g4. AlphaZero pushes g4, continuing the kingside pawn storm and restricting black's options. Stockfish tries king g8, but the position is hopeless. King g8 and g5. AlphaZero advances the g-pawn to g5, and Stockfish captures with h takes g5, but AlphaZero recaptures, maintaining the attack. H takes g5 and h takes g5. The pawn exchanges continue, and AlphaZero's passed pawn on g5 becomes a powerful asset. Stockfish plays knight c5, trying to create counterplay. Knight c5 and king f3. Stockfish brings the knight to c5, and AlphaZero activates the king to f3, preparing to support the passed pawns. Knight b7 retreats, but the position is dire. Knight b7 and rook dd1. AlphaZero brings the rook to d1, and Stockfish plays knight f5, trying to create activity. Rook e4 centralizes the rook. Knight a5 and rook e4. AlphaZero activates the rook to e4, and Stockfish plays c5, trying to create counterplay. bishop b2 develops. c5 and bishop b2. AlphaZero develops the bishop to b2, and Stockfish plays knight c6, trying to blockade the passed pawns. g6 advances. Knight c6 and g6. AlphaZero pushes the g-pawn to g6, and Stockfish plays rook c7, trying to hold the position. King g4 centralizes. Rook c7 and king g4. AlphaZero activates the king to g4, and Stockfish plays knight d4, trying to create threats. Rook d2 prepares to support the pawns. Knight d4 and rook d2. AlphaZero brings the rook to d2, and Stockfish plays rook f8, trying to defend. Bishop takes d4, captures the knight. Rook f8 and bishop takes d4. AlphaZero captures the knight on d4, and Stockfish recaptures with c takes d4. Rook d takes d4 recaptures, and the rooks dominate. c takes d4 and rook d takes d4. AlphaZero recaptures with the rook, and Stockfish plays rook fc8, trying to create counterplay. King g5 advances. Rook fc8 and king g5. AlphaZero activates the king to g5, and Stockfish plays rook f8, trying to hold. Rook d2 repositions. Rook f8 and rook d2. AlphaZero brings the rook to d2, and Stockfish plays rook c6, trying to create activity. Rook d5 dominates. Rook c6 and rook d5. AlphaZero activates the rook to d5, and Stockfish plays rook c7, trying to defend. f5 advances the passed pawn. Rook c7 and f5. AlphaZero pushes the f-pawn to f5, and Stockfish plays rook b7, trying to hold. a 3 advances the queenside pawn. Rook b7 and a 3. AlphaZero advances the a-pawn to a 3, and Stockfish plays rook c7, trying to defend. A 4 continues the advance. Rook c7 and a 4. AlphaZero advances the a-pawn to a 4, and Stockfish plays a 6, trying to blockade. Rook ed, 4 doubles rooks. A 6 and rook ed 4. AlphaZero doubles rooks on the d-file, and Stockfish plays rook cc8, trying to create counterplay. Rook e5 activates. Rook cc8 and rook e5. AlphaZero activates the rook to e5, and Stockfish plays rook c7, trying to defend. A 5 advances the passed pawn. Rook c7 and a 5. AlphaZero advances the a-pawn to a 5, and Stockfish plays rook c5, trying to blockade. Rook takes c5 captures. Rook c5 and rook takes c5. AlphaZero captures the rook on c5, and Stockfish recaptures with b takes c5. Rook d6 activates. B takes c5 and rook d6. AlphaZero activates the rook to d6, and Stockfish plays rook a8, trying to create counterplay. Rook e6 dominates. Rook a8 and rook e6. AlphaZero activates the rook to e6, and Stockfish plays king f8, trying to defend. Rook c6 repositions. King f8 and rook c6. AlphaZero brings the rook to c6, and Stockfish plays king e7, trying to escape. King f4 advances. King e7 and king f4. AlphaZero activates the king to f4, and Stockfish plays king d7, trying to defend. Rook takes c5 captures. King d7 and rook takes c5. AlphaZero captures the pawn on c5, and Stockfish plays rook h8, trying to create counterplay. Rook d5 check gives check. Rook h8 and rook d5 check. AlphaZero gives check with rook d5, and Stockfish plays king e7, trying to escape. Rook e5 check continues. King e7 and rook e5 check. AlphaZero gives check with rook e5, and Stockfish plays king d7, trying to defend. Rook e6 activates. King d7 and rook e6. AlphaZero activates the rook to e6, and Stockfish plays rook h4 check, giving a desperate check. King g5 escapes. Rook h4 check and king g5. AlphaZero's king steps to g5, escaping the final check and sealing the game. Stockfish has no more resources. The passed pawns, dominant rooks, and active king are unstoppable. This historic victory showcases AlphaZero's revolutionary approach. Fearless sacrifices, relentless piece activity, and an endgame technique that feels almost human in its creativity. Stockfish, the world's strongest traditional engine, was outplayed in a game that will be studied for generations. Checkmate is inevitable. Stockfish resigns, a masterpiece of modern chess.